Welcome to Landscape Photo Editing Sessions. I'm Raite Arkiri. In this episode, I'm going to be editing a photo to have a dreamy look. So it's going to have kind of a hazy and glowing look after I edit it in Lightroom and Photoshop. So I took this photo and it was quite a risky photo. The waves were crashing in, you can see here. So I only had a few moments that I was able to capture the waterfalls. So I took 3 exposures, one for the sky, one for the foreground, and one for anything else. So as you can see here, this one's underexposed for the sky. This one's kind of a balanced exposure, and it has just a bit of highlight clipping. And then here's another exposure. Should have reset that, but here's another exposure, and this one's for the foreground, but I don't think I'm not going to use this one for the foreground, because as you can see, if I compare it to this one, I like the waterfall detail in this one a little bit better, but I will use this one for the water because it's a bit more smooth. So I'm going to be combining these 2 photos for the foreground and using this one for some of the sky, some of the blown out parts. So I'm going to start off by editing the base exposure. So the first thing I noticed, I kind of didn't really use the rule of thirds in this one, but there's really no rules in photography. But you can see the distortion because only some of the lens captured it, some of the sky. So I'm going to fix that. Go to lens corrections, go to manual. I'm going to constrain the crop, and I'm going to increase the distortion probably by 5 or 6 or 7. Yeah, so that looks good, and I'm also going to level it. So I should have done a pretty good job of leveling. Looks good to me. Also remove chromatic aberrations. Alright, I'm gonna take down the highlights just to get more detail in the sky, and also reduce some of the exposure over here for the bright parts of the foreground. I'm gonna boost up the shadows. These are really dark and I want it bright, and to have that dreamy like look, everything has to be kind of bright. So I'm going to boost up the shadows. I'm also going to boost up the whites because it just adds a little bit more punch to the contrast, but doesn't affect the dark parts more. So it just adds a bit more contrast and also just a little bit more saturation too. But one thing about the whites is that it blows out the highlights quickly. I'm also going to boost up the blacks. And I'm noticing it's still a little bit dark for me, so I'm gonna boost this to maybe around 0.7. So that looks pretty good. I'm also gonna increase the vibrance, so I want a little bit more color in the sky and also the water. And I'm gonna make it a lot more warmer than this. This is way too cool right now. So I'm just gonna increase it maybe to around 8200. And that looks pretty good so far. So if I go soft proofing, it's already a big difference. So it's already starting to get that dreamy like look. Like it's kind of unnaturally bright, I guess. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy those settings. Control-Shift-C, copy. And I'm also gonna uncheck the exposure. Copy. I'm going to select these, paste them. Alright, so what I want to do is if I want to combine the foreground for this photo and this photo, I want them to have the same exposure. I also want to brighten this a little bit because it's a bit too dark if I want to blend it. So with the luminosity mask, it should be 1 EV apart is a good start. Oh, that rhymes. So I gotta do some math. So this one was -2, so it's gonna be 1.3, about there. And then for this one, let's see, that should be 1.3. And that's looks like the same exposure if I compare it. Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and open these in Photoshop. Right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. I'm going to start by combining these two photos. So I'm just going to use a large brush. I'm also going to make a black layer mask on the layer I want the foreground waterfall to be. So I'm going to hold down Alt and click on the layer mask. That'll make a black layer mask. I'm going to use a large white brush with a soft hardness. A soft brush, I mean. Yeah. And then just going to paint along the areas I want to keep. So I'm just going to do a good general selection of this. Just roughly doing it for now. Gonna check my layer mask and then press Alt, click on the layer mask icon, see if I'm missing any spots. I'm gonna disable this layer mask to see if I want to add anything else or actually take away anything else. So toggling this, I'm gonna see if I want to add anything more, and if I hide this, see if I want to lose anything more. So it looks like I gotta use a black brush a little bit more on some of these areas over here just to blend it in a little bit better. I'm also gonna that's good already. Alright, so that's a pretty good job of blending in the shorter exposure to get more detail in the waterfall. So just using a layer mask. But also I'm going to use a luminosity mask to blend the sky in this one. So notice how the foreground exposure was overexposed before, so the sky has those blown out areas. So I'm going to create luminosity mask. Alright, so I'm going to go to my channels, and I'm probably going to use, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and use Brights 2. I'm going to select that, Control, click on the thumbnail, hide that selection with Control H, click on the layer mask, and then just use a large white brush and just paint along the areas. So I'm not going to worry too much about getting it on the foreground because I'm going to make a selection after that. So I'm just going to disable this and see if I'm missing anything. And I think it did a pretty good job. I'm just going to do one more pass. So I'm disabling this layer to see if I missed any parts, and it would show if I didn't do the brush good. So notice how all of the bright parts, those are the parts that are being shown. So I don't want this layer to be shown up on the luminosity mask. I don't want the foreground to be on this layer. I want this layer for the ocean and the foreground. And that's because the longer exposure makes the water smooth and the shorter exposure makes it a little bit more choppy. So I'm gonna do a quick selection tool. Let's see. And just try to do a quick selection of this. So it's having a little bit trouble, so I'm just going to use the polygonal lasso tool just to fix this up. And I'm using the Alt button to deselect, and I already have it on add selection, so I don't have to press shift. So it looks like a good selection. Alright, here, just a little bit here. And then I'm just going to use the refine edge tool to fix up that selection. So I'm going to increase the radius, and the radius may be around 2, and then it's going to smooth that out and just add a little bit more contrast to make the edge a bit harder. So I'm going to save this as a selection output. I'm also going to go to my select. I'm going to save it as a new channel. Alright, now I can go to my layer mask, Control Shift I, I'm gonna invert that selection, and just gonna use the black brush and paint out these areas. Alright. And finally, I'm gonna blend these parts over here so it's just a little bit blown out just along here. So I'm going to make this layer visible, add a black layer mask, holding down Alt, pressing the layer mask icon. I'm going to go to channels, and I'm probably going to use brights. So I'm actually going to create new luminosity mask to represent the new blended image. So I'm going to go ahead and select my thumbnail in a picture and just delete my luminosity mask and generate new ones. Alright, so now I'm going to go to my bright 6. So I just want only the absolute brightest parts of the sky. I'm just going to go to my layer mask for the sky layer, and I'm going to fill it with white by pressing Alt plus Delete, and that will fill the selection with white. So now those parts aren't blown out and it has a pretty good blend now. And if I want to make that effect less obvious, I can just reduce the opacity, so maybe 90% would be a little bit better. Yeah, that looks good. Alright, next thing I want to do is start cloning out some distracting elements. So if you see here, if I zoom in, see these neon green moss or seaweed, those are kind of distracting. And also there's this cloud that just out of the frame here, and that's also a distraction. So I'm just going to create a new layer, just call it cloning. And for this, to fix the cloud, I'm just gonna use a clone stamp tool, size it down, and then hold down Alt to sample the area, and then just gonna paint it back. So I'm gonna toggle it on and off, see if I missed any spots. So just a little bit over here, and that looks pretty good. Next thing, I'm gonna blast through all these little green moss things. So I'm trying to find similar patterns and just cloning them so it looks realistic. And believe me, it makes a difference. You want to do the best cloning job you can do, even if the details are so small. It makes a difference. Alright, so finally finished cloning, and if I hide this layer you can see a pretty big difference. So none of that distracting green stuff, and also that cloud is gone. So there's just a bit of green over here, this kind of algae growing on this rock, so I'm going to fix that, get rid of that color cast or that green stuff. I'm going to add a hue saturation layer, and I'm going to actually colorize it. I'm going to make it red. I'm just going to bring down the saturation a bit and just make it a little bit more orange. Yeah. So I'm going to invert that layer mask, Control I, and then just going to use a white brush and just paint that in. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity of this to maybe around 50, see if that does it. I'm also going to maybe turn down the lightness to make it a little bit darker. Alright, so that matches pretty well. So next thing I want to do is I want to add a bit more contrast in the waterfall. I just want to make these long exposure lines over here, the streams or flowing water. Just gonna add a little bit more brightness to that. So I'm gonna add a curve adjustment layer. Using the targeted adjustment tool, I'm gonna go to some of the bright areas. So I'm gonna try to find the brightest area. I'm gonna increase that just a little bit, and also go to a dark area and just bring that down just a tiny bit. So I just want just a very subtle difference makes a big impact. So I'm going to invert that layer mask and use a large white brush and just paint along the areas I want the contrast to be. So just a subtle difference will make it look pretty good. I'm also noticing a little bit of kind of a weird darkness over here, some uneven toning, and that's from the blending and also just the long exposure. So if I want to fix these kind of dark blotches of water, I'm gonna do a dodge and burn layer. So to create a dodge and burn layer, I'm gonna create a new layer, but by pressing Control Shift and End, that'll allow me to bring up this dialog. It'll make it easier to just make a dodge and burn layer. So I'm gonna change the mode to soft light and fill it with a soft light neutral color, which is 50% gray. So I'm gonna add that, and I also know I want to make one right here too. So this dodge and burn layer is only going to affect the original foreground. So I want to take out these dark areas, so I'm going to use a white brush with a low opacity. So maybe 20% will be good. But what I want to do is choose a luminosity mask first. So I want it to only affect the dark areas. And I'm going to select darks 1 because it makes a good general selection. Go back to my layer 1 and then start brushing in those areas to get rid of that blotchy toning. So I just want to even it out just to make it have a flat, like uncontrasty look, or not very much contrast, to make it have that dreamy look. So I'm just going to even out just a little bit over here too. Alright, so that's about all I can do for this layer, and that really evened out those areas. Next thing, I'm going to do it for this waterfall layer. So I'm going to even out some of the dark areas over here. And maybe if this one's a little bit too much, so I'm just going to reduce the opacity 70%. And that does a good job of blending, make it a bit more natural. Alright, so next thing I want to do is I want to add a bit more contrast in the sky. So a good technique to do this is to use the luminosity mask and choose the midtones. So I'm going to select midtones 2, select that. It makes a good general selection, but by using the midtones it won't affect the darkest areas or the brightest areas. So I'm going to create a new curve adjustment, and that'll create a layer mask on the curve adjustment based on the selection. So now I can just reduce the brightness of this curve adjustment. If I just pull this down, it'll add more contrast without affecting the bright areas. So it'll get those midtones a little bit more pop. So I just want to also be subtle with this, not too much. So that looks pretty good. But I don't want it to affect the foreground, so I'm going to go back to my sky selection that I saved. I'm going to select it. Going to invert it with Control-Shift-I. Invert the selection and just fill it with the black. So that was a mistake, but yeah, fill it with black. There we go. And I'm just gonna add a little bit more white, just a little bit of a fade, so that it'll blend in the ocean just a little bit, so it makes it a little bit more natural. So actually what I gotta do is go back to my midtones 2, select that, and then go to my sky channel and actually go to select, load selection, go to sky, and I'm also gonna subtract the sky channel that I saved, subtract it from the current selection, so that only the midtones in the foreground is selected right now. So I'm gonna hide that, Control H, and just gonna paint along a little bit on the foreground. So I just want to blend in the ocean just a little bit better. Oh, the opacity is at 20, so I gotta change that back to 100. So I'm just gonna do a light blend and just gonna go small brush, and I don't want these rocks to be affected. Alright, so that's pretty good. So I added a good amount of contrast and it still looks natural. Alright, next thing I want to do is I want to flatten out some of these darker areas. So I want to really flatten out the water. It's still kind of choppy and contrasty. So another method I use to do that is also create a dodge and burn layer. So soft light, fill with 50% gray. And I'm going to go to my channels. I'm going to select a darks. So I'm going to go down and go to one that has a good selection of the dark parts of the water. So darks 3 has like a kind of a good amount. So the blacks are, the bright parts are black, the dark parts are white or grayish. So I'm going to select that, go to my dodge and burn I just created, and I'm just going to use a white brush with a pretty high opacity and then just brush along the dark parts. So this will flatten out the choppy parts and reduce the contrast. And I'm also just going to fix that part. I'm just going to paint in gray back in to that rock right there. Alright. So notice how it looks pretty unnatural, brightening it that much. So I'm going to reduce the opacity of this, maybe to 40%. No, let's try 50. Alright, so that looks pretty good, and it really smoothed out that choppiness and reduced the contrast, which is what I wanted. Alright, next thing I want to do is reduce the brightness of this general area right here. So this water is kind of flowing into here and it's kind of making a lot of white water. And I kind of want to reduce the brightness because I want your eye to lead to the waterfall and not get distracted by this area right here. So I'm going to create another dodge and burn layer. So soft light mode, fill with 50% gray. And this time I'm going to go to my brights channel, brights 1, select that. And then just use a large black brush with kind of a lower opacity, I guess 20%, and just paint along the areas I want to darken. Alrighty, so that's a lot darker, and maybe just hint down the opacity, maybe 70%. Alright, that looks pretty good. So it makes the eye more focused on the waterfall by getting rid of those distractions. Alright, next thing I want to do is brighten up the waterfall, but I'm not going to use a curve adjustment. I'm going to use a dodge and burn layer too, because it allows me to brighten only the bright parts. And also, yeah, you can do that with a curve adjustment, but it just gives you more control because you can just brush the amount, and it also allows you to darken it by using black. So I'm going to create another soft light layer. Then go to my channels and select maybe brights 2. And then I'm just gonna use a low opacity and then just brighten up the waterfalls. So paint along these areas I want to brighten. So if I toggle the visibility, you can see the difference. It added more contrast, but by only brightening these bright areas. So I'm just going to do it just a little bit more. And that looks pretty good. Alright, next thing I want to do is adjust the color a bit more in this picture. So I kind of want more blue in the water over here, and also just a little bit more blue over here. But in the shadows, I actually want to make it a little bit more warmer and have a reddish tint. So that'll add a little bit more color contrast. So I'm going to do that. A good method is hue saturation layer. So I got to deselect first. Control D. I always forget to do that. I'm actually going to colorize the water, and I'm just going to make it kind of a cyan blue. And that looks good. So I'm going to invert that mask, go to my brights, maybe brights 2, and then just paint along the areas I want the water to be a bit more blue. So it's already looking a bit too blue, so I can just tone down the opacity, maybe 50%, and now it looks pretty good. I'm actually gonna maybe a little bit more lighter blue and just adjust the saturation just a little bit, see what it does. So that looks pretty good. Next thing, I want to add more red to the darker parts. So I'm going to create another hue saturation layer. I'm going to colorize this one kind of a orangish red, and then invert it. Control I, invert the layer mask. Go to my channels and then select maybe darks 3. And then just brush along the areas I want a bit more red. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good already. And I'm happy with that. So one thing I forgot, these rocks are a little bit dark for me. To have that dreamy look, I want the foreground and the rocks to be brighter than, I guess, unnaturally bright to make it have that look. So I'm gonna do another dodge and burn layer. And this time I'm just gonna go to my channels, go to maybe darks 3, I guess. Select that, control, select the thumbnail, and then use a white brush and just paint along the areas I want brightened. So I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit more, so just to get more subtle difference. Alright, so that's a big difference, and I'm just going to tone down the opacity maybe to 80% just to balance it out more. Alright, that's good. And final step for color, I want to really make the colors pop and add like a dreamy kind of color contrast look. And it's also gonna make it just a bit kind of cinematic, I guess, but I kind of like to try to do this with images I do. So with some images it works, with some it doesn't. So I'm gonna go to my greens. I want to increase the greens in the sky. So I'm gonna go to my target adjustment tool, go to the brights, and just increase it just a little bit. Then go to my foreground or darker part and just add a slight curve. So just not very much, just a little bit. And maybe just a little bit more in the sky. Alright, next thing I'm going to go to my reds. I'm also going to add a S-curve. So I'm going to increase the reds in the sky and just decrease it here. And finally I'm going to go to my blues and just reduce the overall blues. Alright, so it's a little bit too green right now, so go back to my greens and decrease it a little bit in the foreground. So I want a little bit more reds to show up in the foreground. Alright, so this really adds a little bit more contrast because of those S-curves. Let's see. Yeah. I'm also going to go back to my blues and maybe just try to do that again. And I might just bring back just a little bit more blues in the foreground. Alright, so that's looking good, and that's it for the color. I'm just going to reduce this just maybe 80%, just make it a little bit less stronger. Alright, so a final step is to make that glowy, hazy look. So there's an easy way to do it, and it's called the Orton Effect, but this technique is not really the Orton Effect, but it's kind of an easy way to do it. So I'm going to make a stamp layer, so which is a clone or a duplicate layer of everything that's visible. So the shortcut for that is Control Shift Alt and E, and that'll make a copy of everything visible. I'm also going to duplicate it because I'm going to make two of those effects, one for the sky and one for the foreground. So this effect, to make it, I'm just going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and make the blur. So for the foreground, I'm probably going to make it around 25, the blur. So the blur adjusts the glow radius, I guess I'd call it. The glow radius. So the more blurred it is, the more radius of glow you'll see. And then I'm gonna reduce the opacity of this layer to 20%. So this is also a good way to cut down on those high contrast areas. So doing that, it really adds more of a glowy look also. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see a pretty big difference. It cuts down on the high contrast on the edges, and also just in general increases the black levels and just evens out those areas, reducing the kind of a local contrast reduction. And also, I don't really want this layer to affect the waterfall, so I'm just going to add a layer mask and use a black brush and just paint out the waterfall. So because it kind of blurs out the details in the water, because you're literally blurring the image and just making it reduced opacity. So I'm going to leave it on the water and the foreground because it reduces the contrast. I want that to be less choppy, but I want this to be detailed, the waterfall. Looks like I forgot a little bit here. I'm just going to paint it back on to those rocks there. I'm also going to go to my channels, select the sky. I don't want this layer to be affecting the sky, so I'm just going to fill it with black. And then I'm going to go to this layer. I'm going to make a Gaussian blur, but this time I'm going to make it even higher radius for the clouds. But this time I'm actually going to add a contrast or curve adjustment. So the curve adjustment actually makes the glow effect more powerful by making it seem a bit brighter. So I'm just going to add a slight S-curve to that, but I still want to retain the shadows, so I'm not going to bring that down. I'm going to create a clipping mask. I'm going to hold down Alt and it'll only affect this layer. So reduce this opacity to 20%. So 20% is a good amount, but you may, if you do this yourself, you may want 15, 10, 35 to adjust the how strong the effect is. So I'm also just want this to affect the sky, so go do it back to my sky selection and just mask that. So now this is only affecting the sky and this one's affecting the foreground. So notice how that curve, it adds a bit more glow effect to that. I'm actually going to bring this down a bit. Since I don't want the clouds to be brightened up too much. I just want the glow around the brighter part. So I even can add this glow to this layer too, if I add a glow, so you can see how it affects that. But I don't think it looks good with this affecting the foreground. So that's it. Made the dreamy hazy effect and a lot of cool techniques. Luminosity mask just to make, and blending two layers, compositing I guess from two different exposures, using dodge and burn layers to even out the blotchy tones, clone stamping to get rid of distractions, using hue saturation to kind of get rid of color cast or colors you don't want, adding more brightness to the waterfalls with curve adjustments, and just in general a lot of more adjustments. Alright, so thanks for watching this. I hope you learned a lot of cool stuff, and please share this with your friends. Alright, thanks for watching.